FlyKnight is the sort of game where you can easily behead an enemy, only to have them then just kick you in the face. Or cut the legs off of a zombie to keep it from eating your brain, and well, look at him, he wants to kill me, he just can't anymore. Oh, and also there are some boss fights, but hey, if you're finding all this too stressful and need a break, there's also fishing. In short, this is a game where you play as a fly who lost his wings on a quest to get them back, and the entire world is stuck in Runescape mode, or maybe just retro mode. The game has quite a lot to offer. But for me personally, what kept me coming back was the Dismemberment system that had me constantly swapping weapons in a shorter time than the average TikTok takes to move on to the next topic. And so let's get into it, starting with the combat. And I do suspect that this is going to be a little bit hit or miss for people, because the combat in FlyKnight is slow and clunky. But unlike a lot of games that end up feeling terrible with slow and clunky combat, because it happens by accident through jank and unintended consequences, here it is slow and clunky by design. Each of your attacks cost a significant amount of stamina, and with some weapons, if you miss your attack, the recovery is punishing. But at the same time, this is all the intended experience. So, enemies more or less follow the same rules. Yeah, some of them will spam their attacks almost mercilessly, but the enemies that deal devastating amounts of damage have enough of a telegraph that you can always block their attacks. And for some of the spammier enemies, they tend to use projectiles which you can simply dodge out of the way by moving. Though admittedly it felt like some bosses cheated just a little bit, though we'll talk about that later. When I first started playing the game, I did find the combat to be slightly uncomfortable. My first couple fights were a bit of a struggle. The first couple fights are also easy enough that I wasn't really going to lose, but I was healing more than I would have liked. However, what immediately had me interested and kept me coming back is the Dismemberment system, because this is awesome and I would love to see it in more games. So instead of an enemy's body just being a big old squishy target zone, or maybe having one critical weak point like the head, instead it's made up of various segments, and your weapons are able to sever or destroy these parts. And you'll want to make sure that you're using the most effective weapon for the task. So look for a little shield icon. If that happens, the enemy is blocking your damage. Whereas if you have a big old orange spiky thing, that means you did a good job and dealt a big hit. So for example, if you want to do more damage against a plant, you'll probably want a slashing weapon, as it'll soak blows from your blunt weapons like no tomorrow. Whereas that same slashing weapon might bounce off the armor of a heavily plated insect, who can easily get crushed by the oversized mace weapon, which is really fun. In addition to this, your angle of attack can be important. You can aim from different directions by moving your character if you want to deal the most damage. Admittedly, it's pretty tricky to do, especially since the game uses first-person combat. And to be honest with you, I kind of just bashed away at enemies without worrying too much about direction, and got through the game just fine. And out of all the weapons, my two favorites were ones I picked up fairly near the end. First of all, a giant hammer, because what isn't fun about using a giant hammer to just bonk enemies? If you like Unga Bunga builds, then you're absolutely going to love it. The other was the halberd. Not only does this provide really good reach, but it has multiple angles of attack, and I found it to be a very effective tool for dealing with the most annoying enemies, specifically those that were agile and tended to throw projectiles at you or otherwise kite you. And against multi-armed enemies, well, don't worry, the halberd was super effective at chopping away those arms, reducing the number of weapons they're able to use to attack me, and like you saw at the start, also really good at cutting off zombie legs, because zombies can't charge you if they've got no legs. Just be aware, by the way, that dismemberment does not always mean death, and yes, even if you sever some enemies' heads, sometimes they're still going to try to kick you. And given the game's length, I did find there to be a pretty good amount of enemy variety. I was often aiming for headshots, since most enemies weren't going to survive without their head for long, but then against some trickier enemies like the Wasp Samurai, I couldn't really pull the headshots off, or against the zombies, their head is actually the tough part, so instead I aimed for a different area of the body. First-person combat is really not my thing. I very much prefer third-person combat, and so I did at times struggle to aim my weapon attacks. I don't know if this was just a perspective thing or what, but sometimes I'd be like, yeah, I'm dead on, gonna bop this guy in the face, and my attack would miss. Why? I don't know. And then the enemy would hit me, and then I'd swing again, and then I'd hit the enemy, and then they'd probably die. Didn't happen often enough that it was really frustrating. Did happen often enough that I noticed it and wrote a note for my review script. And if you're wondering, do I just ad-lib all this stuff? No. I do keep notes as I'm playing the game, and I do write a script. Mostly. Sometimes I vary, go off script a little bit. Now, in addition to your attacks, you can also use spells. I use them a bit. Sometimes dropping a tornado on enemies was really nice. Aside of that, none of the spells really spoke to me. You can use a bow to attack from range. Ammo is technically limited, but I found so many arrows that I was never in danger of running out. And you have a couple other special moves. For example, with left trigger, you can block enemy attacks. This reduces the damage based on the block ratio of your shield or weapon. You know, typical Souls-like stuff. And if you use block plus attack at the same time, if the enemy is attacking you, you get a little bit of a counter or parry situation that disrupts the enemy's attack and gives you an opening. If you kick the enemy during the opening, you knock them down, potentially pushing them off a cliff, and have a big old window in which you can do damage. I did this from time to time, but I didn't find consistent openings to use this counter on all foes, so sometimes I just beat them to death the good old-fashioned way. Now, something else about FlyKnight is you don't really have builds. Yes, you're able to equip different weapons in your loadouts, and as a note, each of the weapon loadouts does not contribute weight, only the active one does, so feel free to experiment, fill up all those slots, maybe grab a crush, slash, and pierce weapon. But the thing is, all the weapons have different attack ranges, different attack angles, different damage types, and different amounts of damage. So I was constantly experimenting. Pretty much every time a weapon dropped, I'd kind of compare the stats to what I was using currently, and if it looked favorable, I'd put it on and I'd try it. Some of these I really liked, others I did not. And you could always just chuck them in your stash if you didn't find a weapon to your taste. Or I'd also say the game does a pretty good job of adding strengths and weaknesses to weapons. The big bonk mace I've talked about, for example, does absolutely massive damage, and in just a couple hits it can pop an enemy's head. Which seems too good to be true, right? Well, it kinda is, except for the fact that if you ever miss, you then have this glacially slow recovery animation that takes so long, you're probably going to get off of your rhythm, which means you're probably going to miss again, which means you're going to effectively stun lock yourself for like 8 seconds while the enemy is beating on you. I guess the good news here is most enemies won't kill you in that time unless you are already low health, but it does make healing pretty darn difficult, and in addition to that, your healing is a limited resource. Most of the time when I died, it was not because I just got surrounded by enemies or overwhelmed, it's because I ran out of healing charges, and instead of going back and backtracking, I was like, no, I can go just a little further, I'm sure there is another campfire, and instead there's a couple enemies and I died. Oh well, it's not like the fate of my entire species is riding on this or anything. Then of course you have the boss fights. Now, the game does not have that many bosses, but each fight is wholly unique. The first, for example, is a giant plant, which I forgot to record. The second is a powerful warrior who weaves magic into his attacks, and then the last one is a pure spellcaster. One thing that disappointed me slightly though, is the bosses didn't have breakable body parts, it was just do damage to kill them. In terms of a fight difficulty, I found them overall to be pretty easy. The plant I killed on my first try, the warrior I killed on my first try, and the spellcaster I killed after 1 death, so 2 total tries. That said, despite it being pretty easy and the enemy attack patterns being fairly simple, it does absolutely force you to reassess your toolkit because your stamina regenerates pretty slowly, and it regenerates even more slowly the higher your weight. So if you have high weight, you're going to want a good shield that can significantly cut the amount of stamina reduced when you block. And you'll probably also want something with high fizz block so that you don't take too much chip damage. On the other hand, if you're going for a lighter build, you won't really be able to take hits, but you can kind of just circle strafe and avoid a lot of the enemy attacks anyway. I didn't end up doing this too much against bosses, but that's more because from a first-person perspective, I had a really hard time gauging depth and distance, so I'd very often get hit by something that I thought I was going to avoid, and then watch enemies just randomly miss me when I was sure they were about to hit me. But hey, at the end of the day, each of the boss fights were memorable, and you can't really ask for that much more in a Souls-like game. And if you need a break from all the fighting, the game has some fishing. Throw out your rod, wiggle it around a bit, wait for a fish to bite, then reel that fish in. You can then consume those fish for buffs, which I did do on the final boss, but the game wasn't hard enough that I really felt I needed it otherwise. I'm sure I would have breezed through several other gauntlets or encounters if I had been using buffs from the fish. As one note, fishing was a little bit buggy where sometimes I would go down to the watering hole area, and instead of a fish being in the pond, they'd be spawned on the edge where you couldn't catch them. This game does have a fair number of small bugs, some of which are a little bit immersion breaking or otherwise trippy/weird, though for me, none of them resulted in game crashes or ruined my experience. And then you have the exploration, aka the thing you do when you're not bashing enemies' skulls in. This was overall pretty fine. The levels had a definitive logic to them, so I kinda knew where to go. I could very often see lights or torches in the distance, so I knew there was going to be something of interest over there. And as I was going, there were often quite a few enemies to interact with along the way. I wouldn't say the exploration was super memorable for me, and honestly I just kind of put that down to the graphics, but at the same time, the combat was fun, and exploration was always an excuse to fight more enemies. And so, with all of that said, what's the verdict? Well, the combat was good. Yes, it's clunky, but it's clunky by design in a way that feels very intentional. And personally, I have no problem with clunky combat, so long as I can feel that intentionality as opposed to the weird randomness you get when the clunk is a result of jank. And the dismemberment system was excellent, which made engaging with combat really fun, because I wasn't really thinking about, ooh, I better watch my stamina and only use it up super carefully so that I don't have the super slow-mo punish attack that you get if you attack when you're out of stamina. I was like, ooh, can I cut off his arms? Can I cut off his legs? Oh god, am I a terrible person for wanting to do all this dismemberment? You know what? I don't care. This is awesome. And so yeah, I may have dismembered quite a few bugs across the roughly 5 hours I spent playing the game. And as for the bosses, they're pretty good. Like I said, a little bit on the easy side, but each is a unique fight and they test you in different ways. You go from just hitting a big old plant to doing kind of almost pseudo jumping puzzles to avoid boss attacks. And the exploration was also pretty good. Not super memorable, but I didn't get lost too much, and it wasn't too frustrating, plus the enemy variety was decent, so I more or less treated exploration as an excuse to engage in combat, and sometimes I actually found some of my most challenging encounters just by exploring, like when I first came across this Wasp Samurai. I swear I thought this guy was the first boss of the game because he had so much health, he was doing so much damage, and he had some pretty darn cool and flashy moves. Turns out I just knew very little about what I was getting myself into because he is absolutely not a boss, and later on you fight several more of him. But if you kill enough of them, you do get their armor, and that's pretty sweet. So with all that said, I think FlyKnight's a good game, and I definitely recommend it, especially if you're looking for a Souls-like experience that's a little different from the norm, because this doesn't feel like most of the other Souls-likes on the market. Probably because it draws more inspiration from Kingsfield, the predecessor game to Dark Souls, than from games like Dark Souls itself. And I also found the simplicity to be refreshing. Because yeah, sometimes I like getting lost in stats and numbers and optimizing, but sometimes I just want to take a big old hammer and bonk some things on the head, without having to worry about allocating stats to maximize my damage. And this is exactly the experience offered by FlyKnight. Plus the game's $6, which if I was a billionaire, I'd probably tell you is above the price of a banana. Except with how 2025 is going, in a couple months it might actually be the price of a banana. Hopefully not. So yeah, those are my thoughts on FlyKnight. If you enjoyed this, do be sure to get subscribed, ring the notification bell, and maybe leave a like while you're down there. And if you're looking for something else to watch, there's going to be something on screen and in the description below. This is actually one of the games that I did 100%, which is really easy when the game only has 5 achievements, and you get one of them for each boss, so that's 3. You get one of them for making your character, and you get one of them for catching all the fish. Which I have to say is the hardest achievement in the game, because it took me like an extra hour after beating the game to then go back, look at all the fishing holes, panic about the fact that I thought I had missed something of the very first one at the start of the game, which you can't go back to, realizing, no, there's actually a fish that I'd missed in a completely different spot after checking like all the waterways because it wasn't in a fishing location, catching that fish, and yeah, all the fish caught, 100% of the game unlocked. Turns out, absolutely worth it. Thanks for watching to the end, glad you enjoyed, see you in the next one.